our keynote address. And so I'd like to introduce Dr. M. Shawn Copeland, Professor Emerita of Systematic Theology at Boston College, and is an internationally recognized scholar and award-winning writer. She is the author and/or editor of 6 books, as well as 130 articles, book chapters, and essays on spirituality, theological anthropology, political theology, social sufferings, gender, and race. Most recently, she and Laurie Cassidy collaborated in editing Desire, Darkness, and Hope, Theology in a Time of Impasse, a collection of theological essays engaging the work of Constance Fitzgerald, OCD. Copeland is a former convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, BCTS, and a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She has been recognized for her contributions to theology and Catholic intellectual life with the John Courtney Murray Award, the Marinist Award, the Monica Helwig Award, and hey, we even have our lecture series in honor of her name here at the Lonergan on the Edge conference. And so we are privileged to have her come to give her talk here on societal impasse and social grace. Dr. Copeland?
So let me thank the committee for Lonergan on the Edge 2021 for inviting me, and especially to Stephen Kalmy and Chris Kroll. I want to thank Father Obinyaya and Kathleen Cavender and her technologically adroit husband for really working to try to make this come about. And it's confusing for all of us since it worked so well yesterday. We finally had it. And I want to thank you all, the students who are keeping alive this significant endeavor of Lonergan on the Edge. It's important. I caught the end of the last speaker saying that we get so wrapped up in the theory that we forget about the concrete self-appropriation, which helps us to really attend to the situations in which we are, and the life which we are living. So I thank you for doing that. I apologize to David de la Fuente for missing his presentation due to circumstances beyond my control. And again, I want to thank you for associating me with this lecture on contextual theology, the effort to do contextual theology in our Catholic theological world. So societal impasse and social grace. The fracture of national life provoked by the novel coronavirus and its mutants demoralized many of us Americans. Anxiety and isolation drove some of us to fantasy and indifference, others to rage and hostility, and still others to exhaustion and despair. Some of us wallowed in willful blindness, scapegoating, and lies. Others of us touted conspiracy theories or hawked miracle cures. But when Derek Chauvin pressed his knee into George Floyd's neck, we, the people, or at least hundreds of thousands of us, rose up in protest and sorrow, in fear and hope. Indeed, many of us recognize, perhaps for the first time, that we no longer can dodge our nation's historical, cultural, and social dilemmas. Our uncritical surrender to neoliberalism's manipulation of the market economy and the resultant gross inequity, our mockery of politics, our criminalization of poverty and contempt for the poor and working people, our disdain for those who are homeless, our arrogant and casual misogyny that has generated rape culture, our disregard of indigenous peoples, our obliviousness to environmental racism, our condescension to differently abled women and men, our too often capricious incarceration of Black and brown men, youth, and women, our indifference excuse me, our indifference at the deaths of Black and brown youth, men and women, while they are interacting with police or their agents, our hate-fueled crimes against LGBTQI persons, our nativism and bigoted treatment of immigrants and asylum seekers, our persistent racial animus. We grapple with the implications, meanings, and consequences of our recognition. We are undergoing something. The air we breathe is thick with uncertainty, mistrust, and political volatility. Shared cultural assumptions and civic mores are in upheaval, even on the verge of collapse. Each night, we lie down beside gnawing anxiety. We do not know what to do or how to do it. Perhaps our long, languishing moment is redolent of what Christian spiritual tradition knows as dark night, or what Carmelite theologian Constance Fitzgerald identifies in the social domain as impasse, dark night of the world. The notion of impasse refers generally to a situation from which, quote, there is no end, no way out, no way around, no rational escape from what imprisons us. Every normal manner of acting is brought to a standstill, and ironically, impasse is experienced not only in the problem itself, but also in any solution rationally attempted. Every logical solution remains unsatisfying at the very least. Any movement out, any next step is canceled, and the most dangerous temptation is to give up, to quit, to surrender to cynicism and despair in the face of disappointment, disenchantment, hopelessness, and loss of meaning, close quote. The more we thrash about in attempts to escape a situation, the worse it becomes. Thoroughgoing impasse, Sister Fitzgerald writes, puts an end to our habitual ways of acting and thinking, neither reason nor logic, neither careful analysis nor meticulous planning can resolve the matter or lead to resolution. Rather, we must acknowledge our powerlessness and engage practices of openness, of waiting, of what Dorothy Solek called revolutionary patience for what cannot be demanded. The unexpected, the alternative, or the new vision lies just beyond our conscious, rational control and recedes at every attempt to grasp it. Impasse, the strange and discomforting societal situation that we ourselves have made through our refusals to live mindfully. Or as Phil McShane would put it, to live with minding. We live without minding. Our refusals to live reasonably, responsibly, and lovingly in relation to the divine and the entire created order. Robert Doran, who was a mentor, teacher, and friend to many of us gathered today, in Social Grace, raises the basic issue with which I am concerned. Namely, that, quote, theology ought to elevate collective responsibility and the concrete dispensation that is ours into something like social and cultural grace, close quote. This afternoon, I want to think with you about social grace. To sharpen and focus our reflection, I analyzed an event recounted by Episcopal priest and theologian, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, in her Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. First, I relate the anecdote and ask what is at stake in the event. Then consider racism as a systemic or structured result of bias. Third, interrogate human development in a racially biased culture. And finally, say something about social grace, integrating grace in the social order. So the anecdote and what is at issue. In Stand Your Ground, Kelly Brown Douglas recalls an incident that occurred when one morning she took her 2-year-old son to play in a park. After their arrival, the 2-year-old soon settles in and plays at driving a toy car. A short time later, a group of what appeared to be first or second grade students from a nearby elementary school recessed into the park's playground. 2 little boys, one blonde-haired, the other red-haired, purposefully ran toward the car in which Douglas's son was playing. When he saw the other boys running toward the car, the 2-year-old jumped out and moved away. But almost immediately, the 2 little white boys stopped running and began to fight with each other over who would be first in the car. Then the little red-haired boy noticed the little black boy looking. The red-haired boy stopped fighting, pointed a finger at Douglas's son and said, quote, "You better stop looking at us before I put you in jail where you belong," close quote. Before Douglas could react, a white teacher who had been standing within earshot approached. Douglas writes that she expected the woman to admonish the little white boy and direct him to apologize. Instead, she writes, the teacher, quote, "looked at my 2-year-old son as if he were the perpetrator of some crime and said to the 2 little boys, 'Come on with me before there is trouble,' close quote." Douglas took her son home. She left that park driving in tears. "I felt," she recalled, quote, "an unspeakable sadness and pain," close quote. She continues, "At 2 years old, my son was already viewed as a criminal. At 7 or 8 years old, the link between a black body and a criminal had already been forged in the mind of a little white boy. If at 2 years old, my son was regarded as guilty of something by the white teacher, I feared what his future would bring as he got older," close quote. What is at stake in this anecdote? Certainly the long, compound, complex, and fragile work of character formation in and for each of these 3 little human beings. The little red-haired boy is angry. Perhaps he has played with the toy car frequently and just as frequently raced against the little blonde boy to take the prize. But now a little black boy, although younger and smaller, has intruded into, quote, his, close quote, space. The little red-haired boy does not like the little stranger looking at him. He lashes out, repeats words he has heard, perhaps from a parent or relative or television or radio commentator. An adult, relevant, perhaps even significant to his formation of character, affirms his anger and reaffirms his feeling that black bodies are dangerous, even criminal, and so should be punished and jailed. The little black boy sees the bigger boys coming, jumps out of the car and watches intently. The sudden angry outburst directed at him hurts and confuses. Perhaps he experiences an inchoate sense of wrongdoing, even guilt about being in the park, about looking. Certainly, he feels unwelcome in public space. Perhaps he even experiences anxiety about his body, about his race. An adult, relevant and significant to the formation of his character, removes him from this uncomfortable space and wrestles with the disconcerting knowledge that quite likely her son will have such encounters again. Excuse me. What is at stake in this anecdote is the character formation of 3 little human beings, but not their individual formation only or merely. We humans are social beings embedded in biological, genetic, neurological, and psychic sets of schemes of recurrence, relating us unconsciously and consciously to others. What is at stake in this brief narrative is our human capacity for recognition and acknowledgement, correction and self-correction, humbled and determined efforts to face up to and eradicate bias in our personal, interpersonal, and communal living. What is at stake is our shared civic culture, our national character as a moral community. What is at stake is realization of the human good with its dependence on the genuineness of human persons, on human attention, intelligence, judgment, responsibility, appropriate and adequate action, on the quality, verve, and authenticity of human relationships. Bias and racism. We recall that Lonergan deploys the term bias quite precisely to denote aberrations of human understanding or affect that exclude and repress insights and the further questions they may generate. Bias stems from the flight from insight. It is the more or less conscious and deliberate choice to be incorrect or to repress or to deny the surfacing of further questions or insights, the refusal to think, to act, and to live attentively, intelligently, rationally, and responsibly. All human beings are susceptible to bias, as it distorts and inhibits our conscious performance in everyday living by blinding our understanding, stunting affective growth, and damaging the achievement or realization of community. Bias may occur in any of four principal ways, as we know: dramatic, individual, group, and general. Dramatic bias takes the form of the denial of painful affect in the day-to-day living out of our lives. This may be brought to light by psychology. Individual bias expresses itself in egoism and self-regarding self-regard. Group bias expresses itself in singular regard and safeguarding the exclusivity of privileges and prerogatives that ensure the prominence and dominance of, quote, my, close quote, particular group or association or social class or race at the expense of the common and shared human good. Finally, through the general bias of common sense smugly considers itself omnicompetent, jousting against science or technical specialization, against theory or philosophy. This last form of bias plays a distinctive role in constructing and distorting insights for the practical, intelligent, imaginative ordering of the human good for healing and creating in history. Individual, group, dramatic, individual, group, and the general bias of common sense function as alienations of empirical, intellectual, rational, and responsible consciousness. Now, the most concise definition of racism is prejudice plus power. Prejudice literally conveys prejudging, that is, coming to judgment about something or someone prior to experience or knowledge of or encounter with that something or someone. Because prejudice stems from ignorance, may be corrected and judgments revised. But the refusal to accept correction, to revise judgments, to incorporate corrected information and new judgments into one's repertoire is bias. Racism is the spoiled fruit of bias. It links attitudes or feelings of superiority to putatively legitimate exercises of power. A comprehensive definition of racism comes from the work of James Lee Boggs. Racism, he writes, is, quote, systematized oppression of one race of another. In other words, the various forms of oppression within every sphere of social relations: economic exploitation, military subjugation, political subordination, cultural devaluation, psychological violation, sexual degradation, verbal abuse, and so on, together make up a whole of interacting and developing processes which operate so normally and naturally and are so much a part of existing institutions of society that the individuals involved are barely conscious of their operation, close quote. Racism then does not rely on the choices or actions of a few lone or even so-called rogue individuals. Rather, it is structured or institutionalized. Indeed, racism as bias is woven into the fabric of our daily human living. If we define culture as the various sets of meanings and values that inform the way we live, then racism has infiltrated those meanings, shaping our ideas, attitudes, and dispositions, directing our norms, rules, and expectations, guiding our linguistic, literary, artistic, media representations, and sociocultural practices. In short, we have generated and sustained, live and work, love and worship within a racist culture. Group bias, as expressed in racism or sexism or homophobia, economic exploitation, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia, are not out there, they are in us. They are sedimented in our consciousness. They suffuse all our decisions about the concrete human setup. They penetrate all our relations, and they are involved in the mediation of those meanings and values that constitute our culture. Indeed, bias so structures our worldview that to behave otherwise is deemed unnatural or abnormal. So human development in a racially biased culture. The sad encounter between two little boys, one white, one black, exposes the potential for dramatic and individual bias, as well as for resentment, to take root in the human mind and heart. This encounter also illustrates graphically the intimate connection between what we know, what and how we feel, and how we behave toward ourselves and toward others. Human development is no simple negotiation. Early childhood calls for the development of motor and cognitive skills of every sort. These must be modeled or taught. They are grasped and tried. They are practiced and mastered. Consider some of the shifts in an affective life or feelings or emotions that a school-aged child must effect. The young child's unilateral respect for parents or other adults leads him or her to a morality of obedience or heteronomy. But growth and deepening calls for further development moves them forward. When children cooperate among themselves in a new social life emerges. So too do new feelings of mutual respect for others. Children begin to assign personal value to one another and are not so much concerned with judging or evaluating each other's specific actions. But the most significant and distinctive stage of emotional or affective development, Piaget argues, is the emergence of a more or less organized cluster of values and of the will. He writes, mutual respect and cooperation, which recognize the relative autonomy of individual conscience, lead to an organized system or scale of personal values. For example, honesty, a sense of justice, reciprocity, close quote. Moral educators like Walter Kahn and developmental psychologists such as Lawrence Goldberg point out that as the, quote, sense of justice develops, it reinforces respect for authority and for the rules of adult society, even though it may not overlook more informal peer norms. Now, given this psychological sketch of affective development, what happens to such development in a racially biased cultural setting? Let's revisit Douglas's anecdote. The red-haired boy is on the cusp of the shift from heteronomy to autonomy. His cognitive and affective behavior have been shaped by unilateral respect for parents and adults, teachers, or perhaps pastors, leaders of other sort. Perhaps despite fighting with the little blonde boy, he has begun to feel respect for him and for his other classmates. Perhaps this little boy yearns to cooperate with him. Perhaps he has begun to think about what is fair, not yet justice, but to think about what is fair, about sharing, about being honest. But on this particular morning, it seems as if he is unable to risk a further move. For whatever unintentional feeling, for whatever reason, the presence of the little black boy unsettles and aggravates him. He speaks in an imperative, even imperious tone. You better stop looking at us before I put you in jail where you belong. The utterance carries the force of a command, even a threat with well-defined consequences. It resonates with surety, control, authority. I can put you in jail. The sentence is inflected with racial recognition and racial stereotypes that shape not only how we see Black people, but how we interpret their behavior, their actions, or facts about them. Further, this utterance warns of a boundary. Stop looking at us. The fight is finished, and now it's us and you, insiders and outsider, free and controlling, restricted and controlled. The little boy is only 7 or 8. He repeats or says what he has heard or picked up. In this event, he remains on the cusp of autonomy, and he clings to the familiarity of what he has heard or what he has learned. The teacher's mistaken affirmation encourages both little white boys to develop an idealized picture of themselves as in control, sure and authoritative, perhaps even to hold themselves aloof and apart from others who may be different, perhaps not only in race, but ethnic heritage or gender or sex or social class. Certainly, intersubjectivity, the basic component of our humanity within which affective and cognitive development may occur, is disrupted. 3 little boys are left with sets of distorted experiences and impressions, as well as emotions that become the foundation for distorted understandings of and affect toward others. That the 2-year-old little Black boy jumps out of the car as the 2 white boys approach, perhaps signals that he has already imbibed something of what it might mean to be, quote, other, close quote. He is excluded, insulted, made to feel an outsider and unwelcome. The message is, you do not, he does not belong. Indeed, in the presence of one of the 2 most important adults in his life, he has been threatened for looking. He is considered a potential troublemaker, a potential criminal. He is the object of instruction from others, not an instructor. He is the object of this incident, not its subject. He well may remember this day, mull it over, use it as a reference point, or he may come to suffer ressentiment, that powerful, intentional, reactionary emotion welling up in persons who have been emotionally hurt or injured and who are prompted by reactionary resistance to those wounds. We may discern ressentiment among persons and groups who experience suppression or social domination. Should the 2-year-old repeatedly relive and refeel the hurt or shame, he might well experience psychic self-poisoning. Douglas removes her son from what has become a physically dangerous space as quickly as she can. They go home. For most human beings, self-esteem remains a fragile achievement. For persons who experience social oppression, it is even more tenuous. As a priest and a theologian, Douglas has the resources to comfort his little spirit, to bolster his courage, and to challenge him to authentic emotional and affective growth. But she possesses neither the resources nor the social power to adequately protect him from biased authorities who, themselves in fear and panic, might end his life. 3 little boys with sets of distorted experiences and impressions, as well as emotions that may become the foundation for distorted understandings of and affect toward others. The incident illustrates the ability of racism to disrupt basic intersubjective spontaneity. Yet, inasmuch as the account of bias is compatible with Lonergan's cognitional theory, the biases are correctable. Conversion or transformation of mind and heart, behavior and action are possible. conversion or transformation of human persons, their cultures, and societies is possible. Such conversion or transformation is costly, but possible. Integrating grace. In our concrete universe of being, the order of grace is distinct, but it is not sealed off from and separate from the order of reason and the order of nature. Jean-Marc Laporte reminds us that the, quote, universality of grace ranges beyond the ecclesial and sacramental and enters into the secular and the day-by-day realities of life, even when these lack explicit Christian or religious motivation, close quote. There's something similar here ringing in Chris Krall's presentation, I think. For grace floods human hearts through the gift of the Holy Spirit and pours out divine love on the whole of creation. What is at stake is our willingness to accept and to pay the price of integrating grace in our living. The just and good and beautiful America for which we long is nested in the minds and hearts, behaviors and actions, the character formation of our children. And the conditions for that formation depend upon our attention, intelligence, judgment, responsibility, and action. We must be willing to incarnate what Australian theologian Kathleen Williams calls that, quote, friendly authenticity, close quote, through which we seek another's well-being. Her concern dovetails with Lonergan's insistence that the key to achieving the human good is located in personal relationships, in relationships between and among persons. We model friendly authenticity for these three little boys in Douglas's account by reaching out and breaking down barriers, by patiently, consistently, and gently refusing to indulge hostility and calculated misunderstanding. We model such behavior for them and for all our children when we meet one another as, quote, unique treasures rather than as threats, writes Laporte. For grace affirms rather than suppresses difference. We model such friendly authenticity by gently coaxing forward the wonder, affectivity, and psychic growth of our youngsters, even as we scrutinize ourselves. For many of us have experienced and know the delight of casual encounters, deepening into rich and authentic and lasting friendships. And many of us have experienced and cherished the bloom of encounter into marriage and intimate love into family. Could the adults in the anecdote have responded differently? Perhaps. The teacher could have reached out, not to affirm or brush away the little boy's comments, but to correct them. Perhaps Douglas could have reached out, not in exasperation, but in expectation that in such a movement, in such a moment of adversity, something new might emerge. Both adults have the capacity for what Christian tradition names kenosis, for meeting the negative or destructive creatively, with love. Perhaps it is too much to ask the white teacher to respond to a child's churlish behavior in a way that makes space for all children. Perhaps it is too much to ask the Black mother not to defend her child, for Black mothers have been forced to do this in the most extreme circumstances for centuries. This is a moment of impasse. Nothing logical will suffice. Encounter becomes clash, and it is racially charged. Emotions and feelings run high, placing heavy burdens on rational and psychic consciousness, on intellectual, psychic, and moral conversion. Yet it is not a time to surrender to cynicism and despair. The children and the women involved are caught in the reinscription of a centuries-old and traumatic dilemma. Doran has rightly and ever so helpfully emphasized the importance of psychic conversion, quote, if goodwill is to be effectively harnessed in the struggle for social transformation, close quote. Through the gift of grace accepted and actuated in human lives and hearts, our values and practices can meet the effects of racism that vitiate our social order. The realization of justice, of friendship, and beauty within that social order depends upon our critical and humble appropriation of our own subjectivity in religious, moral, and intellectual conversion. It depends upon the critical and conscientious scrutiny of that complex of relationships and relations which shape the social and cultural ordering of our human situation, and it depends upon those judgments of value realized in human praxis. We, women and men, are instances of incarnate moral and ethical choice in a world under the influence of sin, and yet we stand, as Lonergan insisted, in relation to a field of grace. To promote authentic human development and flourishing for those three little boys in that park, and in all our parks and all our places, we must emphasize and engage humanity's essential humanness. Any resistance to racism must be rooted not in arrogant triumph over evil, but in humble love of human persons. Only love can bridge the impasse, the interpersonal abyss that racism generates. That love must acknowledge and witness to the oneness of human creatures and honor the richness of human diversity as the most basic feature of our human unity. At the same time, situating human creatures within the beauty of the order of God's creation. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, Dr. Copeland, I'm going to try some more intertechnological dialogue. I'm going to share my screen with you while sharing your screen with everyone.
Okay.
So there's going to be multiple screen sharings going simultaneously. So that you can get some, hopefully, a sense of the people here.
People.
You can see, dang, I don't know if we can see you though.
I can see people.
You can see people, wonderful.
It's okay if people can't see me, it's all right.
Oops. Well, is there questions from people for Dr. Copeland?
And if there isn't, it's not a problem. It's been a long day for everyone sitting in our boxes on Microsoft Teams or Zoom or wherever we are. And I tried to be really tight and brief because I thought I would start at a certain time and be all ready because I have something happening in not too distant future. But I do have like a good 20 minutes, but if not, it's okay. I will not feel hurt or distressed in any way. Really, don't feel constrained or forced to do this. It's fine. I'm really pleased to have had an opportunity to get back to an IDGE conference since I haven't had an opportunity in so long. So, anyway.
Yeah, we really were grateful that that this worked out to have you come. And
almost.
Yeah, we made it happen. It was like the miracles.
Anyway, you were very kind and persistent, and I deeply appreciate that. Truly.
But Mark has a question for you, actually.
Okay.
Oh boy.
Thank you very much. This was a very stimulating talk. I just want to seek a little more of your wisdom regarding a point you made. there are people who are like psychologically okay, in the first place, who are the victims of, say, racism, of colonialism, and all of those power struggles. And they have grown to accept that they are no goods in the society, and so they are not coming out to make contributions. They are not fighting back constructively. Their own idea of fighting back is just to accept these same powers as being up there always. Oh, we are here, we need to be looking up. So maybe you can say a little more on how such people might experience some psychic conversion.
Millions of people around the world who have this experience. And there is, I think, one way in which people have talked about this in terms of psychopolitical is decolonization. If you know the author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who really from Kenya has put himself really to say that we have to decolonize our own minds. We have to think about ourselves differently, from a different perspective, from a different point of view. And that's very hard work because there's very little that supports and funds that kind of work in the larger social and educational cultural world. So I think yes, I think that this kind of self-love is appropriate self-love. I mean, it puts a certain kind of burden on the whole notion of self-appropriation, because it asks us, in this sense, to have a very critical review of our own experience without falling into blaming or falling into anger, without falling into behaviors that spoil the spirit. The African-American writer, Alice Walker, has a wonderful little novel, and it's called The Third Life of Grange Copeland. No relation. But what happens is a series of terrible and tragic events. And when his little granddaughter comes to him and says, well, I don't know why we can't do that. They did that to us. And he says, hate spoils the spirit. And as soon as your spirit is spoiled, then pretty soon you stop hating X and you start hating all people. You hate yourself. You hate your mother, your father, So it captures for me both how important understanding grace in the social order is, but how at the same time, and not in a Pelagianistic way, there is work for us to do in terms of psychic self-appropriation. So I think yes. There's one final point about this. There's a powerful passage in Tommy Norrison's Beloved, in which Baby Suggs, who is a maternal figure there, who is a preacher, a priest, a mediator of love and salvation, calls people to self-love. Love what has been hated. Love your eyes, love your hands, love your nose, love your lips, love your body, love your legs, dance, and love your heart. Love your heart. So I can take some comfort in knowing that there are people in the larger secular, if you like, culture who recognize this. I mean, you don't have to be a Christian to recognize that hate is destructive. But it's important, I think, to pay attention to that. And it also means being creative. So we've got to come up with projects and institutions that carry on what we decide that we want. So we have to do a better job at education. another famous African-American educator, Carter G. Woodson, wrote a book entitled The Miseducation of the Negro. That is the miseducation. Thinking you have nothing, that you are nothing, that you have no culture, that you had no culture, you were a tabula rasa when you got here. Completely untrue. So I think there are ways that you can find to help in that movement. I don't know if that's useful for you or not. I mean, because you can identify a number of writers and authors in your own context who are struggling and pushing for this constantly. Is that useful to you? Okay. Okay, thank you.
David, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. It's great to virtually be with you, Dr. Copeland. Apologize for folks if there's any echo. Earlier in your talk, you mentioned nativism, and when you said that, I remembered that in some of the versions of Lonergan talking about being in love, he says that the love of one's clan or one's country can be kind of a sign of being in love and so forth. And obviously, in light of our history, like, it's clear that we need to rethink that. But I'm curious about like any particular kind of angles and approaches to rethinking kind of the organization and the meaning of the social organization that is a country in order to combat that nativism.
Well, first of all, yes, there is nativism in the negative, because part of what I said in the beginning is our really disdain for immigrants, and yet the United States certainly is a nation of people who identify themselves as immigrants, and they are people who we are people who disregard indigenous people, and we don't have to see them; they are far away. People who can, I'm sure that Dr. Cecilia Francisco can appreciate this, because something similar happens in Australia, that people are far removed from the day-to-day, in many instances, never all. But there is a way in which, yes, nativism, in the sense that it seeks to redefine the meaning of natality and where we are born in such a way as to exclude, becomes a clear negative. But there is nothing wrong with loving your people. This is the point about indigenous people loving themselves and loving one another, loving the land on which from which their ancestors came and where they are buried. So there, we have to make distinctions. I mean, there's a world of difference in some ways between our understanding, and I think Lonergan accounts for this, between what's happening in 1950. And remember, he's trying to transcend this in a very critical and thoughtful way to expose us to ourselves, and what's going on in 2021. So it's not that we're smarter, but we are in fact able to use our language differently. The other point I want to bring out is that we spend a lot of time now talking about implicit bias. Remember, Lonergan is writing about bias in the 50s. This seems to be, for many sociologists and psychologists, really a virtually new discovery, that to write about implicit bias. If you're familiar with any of that literature that's coming out and that everyone wants to read now, implicit. We've been trying to think about this for a long time. And I guess this is part of my own little personal crusade, because all Lonergan students are missionaries in some way. So in this sense, to try to share with people what bias does, not only to others, but to ourselves. We cut off the possibilities of a richer, fuller life by rejecting others because of some idea about what difference might mean. So it's something for us really to probe and to think about, and to pay attention when we all come together to remind ourselves about, there's a certain relativity to the human condition. I mean, we all have to appropriate the same kinds of motor skills. We all have to, this is Lonergan on the transcultural, which I firmly believe, because it doesn't fill it with content. It gives us some operations that all human beings are engaged in, or in which they can become engaged. Is that useful to you?
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And then also the way you framed it too with natality, thinking, and that was really helpful too. Thank you.
I apologize to you publicly. I do so again for missing your presentation. I'm happy to know that you're reading Willie James Jennings as well as Paul Ricoeur, which proves that we can all help each other if we just start thinking clearly and appropriately about matters of great concern.
Thank you, and no worries that you weren't there. It's still great to be with you.
Steve, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Shawn, for a wonderful presentation. My question kind of follows up on the past two, and you're in the story about those little boys and the two adults. Really, you're kind of focusing on the idea that this racist culture shapes everybody in some way, right? Nobody is, it harms all of us in some way. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of thinking maybe about psychic conversion in particular, or maybe more broadly, if both kind of those of us in the white community, those who do the marginalizing largely, and those who are in communities of color who are marginalized, to what extent do our paths of psychic conversion run parallel and kind of are a joint activity? And to what extent are they different enough that maybe there's kind of, they should be done with at least some separate. Now that I say this, it sounds like a separate but equal kind of question and dangerous. But there are differences, and so how do we do, like you said, the transcultural, the idea that we're all going through the same process, but in some ways it's such different places that we're coming from and need to get to in terms of going through this process. I don't know if you can speak to how do we do that together and how do we do that within subgroups, and yeah, end there.
Well, I think about this in many different ways, and one of the things I might say is that, of course, psychic conversion or understanding of one's psyche, of course, is deeply intimate and personal. Many of us have scars and wounds that we are not eager to reveal. At the same time, there are social scars. And that's what this really is trying to get at, the social and cultural scars that are shared. So if I have to project my superiority on someone, and to do that, I have to make them feel inferior. If I have to denigrate them, if I have to refuse to allow them to use my store, so think in the 50s, Jim Crow segregation meant that you couldn't try on shoes in a department store, that Black people couldn't try on shoes in a department store, that Black people couldn't try on dresses in a department store, or shirts, or you couldn't touch these things. You could only go in and buy them sometimes, and sometimes you came through a different entrance. So we set up a structure which and Martin Luther King says this, of course, that you start to see the woundedness of the character of children. Attention. That they are not worthy, that they are not like everyone else. They are different, and the difference is negative. So I think one of the things to do, and this is something I think important, is that yes, white people have to figure out what has racism done to us. That's your question to figure out. And there are people trying very hard to help you. Dan Horan, who is a graduate of our doctoral program, who is now the director of spirituality at St. Mary's University in South Bend, Indiana, has just written a book on a white Catholic's guide to racism. It's like trying to really think for yourself about what does this say to me, that this is projected onto other people, and that when they see me coming, what do they think? What do they think? Do they think here comes the good guy, or do they think who knows who's coming at me? Another thing to do is to read Elizabeth Wilkerson's latest book, Caste. I mean, to accept that both the National Socialist Party in Germany at the time of Hitler's ascension to chancellor came to the United States to find out how they should treat the Jews. The National Socialist Party in South Africa, the National Party in South Africa, came to the United States to find out how they should deal with Black Africans. We're a paradigm for mistreatment. We're a paradigm for social mistreatment. So in this way, we've got to, I'm not exempting the British or anything like that. They had their own problems, but people came and did something here to find out how white people were so successful here. That should shame us all. Now, the thing is that you have to figure that out, and Black people have to figure out something else. I tried to, in terms of responding to Mark, to point out what's going on in divesting yourself of a negative presumption about yourself all the time. We're all looking for an equilibrium. Sometimes things are working well, I'm able to balance them, and sometimes they're not. So it's not as if there's nobody's done a blueprint for us about this, because it's not in the interest either of it's just not in the interest of capital that we should figure this out. It just is not. It's not in the interest of equality or equity, whatever words you want to use, that we should figure this out. Because whenever we talk about people who are, and everybody hates this word, victimization. Nobody wants to be a victim because it feels passive. But in fact, there is something about our own passivity for all of us as the culture overwhelms us. So there is a way in which we all have to stand up and analyze what it is that's happening to us. And it's happening to all of us. I mean, this is perhaps more rambling than you might want, and you want something firm and concrete. But firm and concrete emerges in the effort to work at something, and to remember, if we are all in some ways to follow the last speaker, to follow Sierra's reflection on de Lubac, I mean, there's a Trinitarian anthropology. How do we mirror that? Well, we don't mirror it by we have to mirror it in the positive. And so how do we do that? That's accepting that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, which is a hard thing, a difficult thing for some of us to do. But doing that means that I can, by my cooperation with grace, begin to make some movement in my own development. I can bring something constructive to the dynamics of the tension and the pull to liberation, the pull to genuineness. And genuineness is not easy for any of us in the kind of situation in which we live, because we mock one another when we are. I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I think we all have to start where we are. We all have to start where we are. And if we begin to understand that our essential humanness is the same, then there's a possibility. There's a possibility. Does that make any sense to you? Does that help you in any way?
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Joseph, you had your hand up. Do you have still a question you want to add?
No, my question has been taken care of, actually. Thank you.
Okay. Peter, you have your hand up.
Yes. Do you think that Pope John Paul II's suggestion to the United Nations in 1995 that there should be a new universal declaration on the rights of nations, do you think that would be useful?
Well, we'd have to know what's in the rights of nations, because we can easily skew the identification of rights of nations to privilege some groups and not others. It's a very strange thing, because I'm sure, and I'm running off here of a news report that really shocked me the other day, and it brought back an experience that I had in South Africa. Ghana is tired of used clothes from the United States. There are huge mounds of used and tattered cheap clothing that are littering the Ghanaian seaside. And I thought of visiting a village in South Africa and going to meet some young school children. And a little boy had on a T-shirt that had University of Michigan on it. And so very naively, stupidly, I asked him, "Oh, do you know someone from there?" He had no idea what it meant. And it brought me up short. And it said to me, we export all kinds of things we don't want. But I had not seen this kind of horrific misuse before. I just had not seen it. And here, mounds of it, nothing that's really good, just really cheap, useless stuff. We don't want it, so you should be lucky to get it. So no, I don't know about a rights of nations. If Ghana can say, I have the right to reject your garbage, yeah, okay. But don't tell me that, we have the right to send it. There has to be some kind of negotiation on how these things come about, to me, it's really disgraceful. And I'm using the word disgraceful in a very clear way, intentionally.
Brian, you want to wrap things up?
Yeah. Okay, well, if you put the pressure on me to make it super eloquent or something, you might be disappointed. But thank you so much, Shawn. It's really good to see you. It's been too long.
Nice to see you too, Brian.
So my question is born from a current sort of pedagogical frustration. I'm incorporating selections from Brittany Cooper's Eloquent Rage into a class wherein I'm also talking quite a bit about the law of the cross. And it's an interesting pedagogical tension being a straight cisgendered white guy up there talking primarily to upper middle class white students, to whom it can be maybe even, let's say, blasé, but it's more acceptable to say something like return love in the face of evil, take on vulnerability in a situation to diffuse tensions, etc. But I feel like I've almost immediately, when I've said that, lost the people of color in the class quite reasonably. First of all, I think your work is just incredible, so I'd appreciate your input in that regard. But you're also much more eloquent than I am in communicating the nuanced sort of navigation of tension. So I wonder if you might be able to speak to how to occupy the space of advocating both for something like deference in the face of, deference is the wrong word, nonviolent self-emptying love in the face of evil, while also recognizing that eloquent rage has a place. Would you mind? Does that make sense? I'm rambling myself.
Sure. And this will probably be our last question, right?
Yes.
Is this right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's this, that first of all, rage doesn't mean that people are necessarily running around pillaging. It doesn't necessarily mean that. You can rage against yourself. And that's very difficult. This is back to part of Mark's concern. I'm thinking of decolonial experiences, a decolonial psychology, even, if you will. But also I think that we can share as teachers our own vulnerability in working with all our students. And a great question is why? So many years ago, Marie Augusta Neal, who was a sister of Notre Dame de Namur, wrote a little book called A Sociotheology of Letting Go. It's relinquishment. And it's appeared in a few other places, some that theme or idea. And I think it's asking what can we all let go of? And maybe while some people are letting go of privilege, others are letting go of a lack of self-esteem. Because just as privilege can be comforting and coddling, so can a lack of self-esteem. It can protect me from failure. I'm not good enough to do that, so I won't try. And it's a point, I think, for us to really think about what this means. Because we all, first of all of us are sinners. None of us are perfect. Race doesn't make you holy or perfect or anything on either side of the spectrum. And just run down, nobody's holy and perfect. We are all struggling. I mean, it's fitful and it's gradual, and sometimes we slip and sometimes we fall, and we get to pick ourselves up and we get going again. And we're all doing that by the grace of God. I think I think that's one thing. And I think maybe trying to read stories or whatever that you're doing, novels or documentaries that also show how many people are in similar situations. If you've seen Nomadland, I mean, what is happening to the white working class? What's happening to ordinary white people? Part of what's happening is resentment, certainly about the few Black people who might have 7-figure jobs, but the average executive is paid 320 times more than the average worker. 320 times. Billionaires are going to space. I mean, this is great. I'm for space exploration. That's really good. But I'm also asking what's happening for people who work in ordinary places? What's happening for them? What's happening to the cashier in the grocery store? What's happening for all these people? And so if we have false ideas about one another that are generated from not a multiple analysis, but a single strand, because we have to multiplicative. This is we're against, some people are worried about intersectionality. All it is a framework or tool to bring together a range of ways of thinking about living in the world in which we do. It's not about anything. That's all it is. It's asking about your economics. It's asking about your relationship, let's say, to technology. It's asking about your gender. It's asking about race. It's asking about your education. It's getting you to think about those things in a complex way, not in a kind of monocausal way. And this is part of our issue. The other thing I would recommend to you to do for yourself before you do it with any students, because it's very dangerous, is to read Howard Thurman, The Luminous Darkness. Howard Thurman. It's a profound meditation. It's a profound meditation on the racial situation in the United States. The luminous darkness. You know Howard Thurman? Howard Thurman was a mystic. He was a theologian. He taught Martin Luther King Jr. at Boston University. He was dean of Marsh Chapel. And he wrote the wonderful little book in about I want to say 39, certainly perhaps 49, a wonderful little book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesus and the Disinherited. 2 Howard Thurman books. Martin Luther King traveled with that book in his briefcase. Everywhere he went, he carried Jesus and the Disinherited. People who are living with their backs against the wall. That's Thurman's definition of disinherited. People who are living, who've been pushed against the wall, who have nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. Send me an email.
I will. Yeah, thank you. I've been meaning to reach out for a while. I've read Jesus and the Disinherited, and it's fabulous. I was not familiar with Luminous Darkness, though. I'll definitely check that in sociology or sociotheology of letting go out. So yeah, thank you so much.
Out of print. It's very old, but it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile looking for those kinds of things that are those kinds of books that are grappling with precisely this idea of what should we do? Well, what should we do? And because we're doing different things doesn't mean that we're not collaborating, because we have a common aim and a common purpose.
Awesome. Thank you, Shawn, very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Copeland. You are a fantastic teacher, a brilliant theologian, a holy person, and you bring it all together to address the issues at the level of our time. So thank you very much.
Well, listen, thank you all for doing what you're doing and trying to bring the message right down front where it belongs, with people who can really begin to enact it and live differently with and among themselves. And thank you for inviting me, and pray for me, and I'll pray for you all.
It's a deal. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Bye.
Goodbye. And just for all of us, if you're interested, tomorrow we begin at 10 a.m. and we go back to Boston College for Robert Elliott, and we have a full lineup until John Dudowski will conclude the session tomorrow at 3:30. So hope to see you back tomorrow at 10 a.m. Have a great evening.
Ciao.